Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming along. It's really wonderful to see so many of you here, and I hope too many of you haven't been affected by the storms. It's nice to see some familiar names there too. We wanted this event to be really informal, so I'm just going to open with some very personal thoughts about my experiences with Barns and thoughts on Barns before handing over to my colleagues Sarah and Tim. So, like many Scottish school children, I first encountered Burns when I was in primary three, in other words, about 7 years old. Like generations of children, around the 25th of January, we were asked to recite a Scottish poem. The poem I recited wasn't by Burns, it was The Puddock by the North East writer John Kay, and I can still remember it. A puddock sat by the Lochan's brim, and he thought there was never a puddock like him. He sat on his hardies, he waggled his legs, and cocked his head as he glowered through the segs. I was particularly commended for the relish with which I described the proud frog's comeuppance. A heron was hungry and needed to sup, so he nabbit the puddock and golloped him up. I'm sure these lines confirmed a lesson I'd been taught well in my North East childhood. I'm from Lossiemouth, for those of you who know the North East. Pride comes before a fall. Others in my class chose well-known favourites such as Jeanie with the Mumps or You've Hurt Your Finger, Poor Wee Thing. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these poems. This was, of course, part of the annual Burns Federation's attempt to get children to engage with Scots poetry, and we were given a certificate for our efforts. In primary 7, so when we were about 11, we finally got to recite an actual Burns poem, for which we were granted the much coveted Gold Burns certificate. Around that time, as a family, we also went to Butlins in Ayr on a family holiday, which included my granny, granda, and auntie. So the whole family went off to Butlins in Ayr, and that included a bus trip to Burns Cottage and a visit to Alloway Kirk. Of course, the setting for Tam O'Shanter. Now, the point of all of this is, of course, that you couldn't and probably still can't grow up in Scotland without knowing something about Robert Burns. As Asif Khan, director of the Scottish Poetry Library, noted about this year's round of Scottish school children reciting poetry, when you read poems at that age, it stays with you for life. I'm not sure I really wanted the puddock staying with me for life, but it has, and he's right. And while Burns may have been barling in his grave, so to speak, at some of our rather couthy Scotch renditions, Khan's acknowledgement that it was a kind of liberation and freedom to be reading poetry in Scots when you seldom heard it at school is valid. The fact that it was frowned upon for the rest of the year is not without irony, of course, but at least for 1 week of the year, we got to say something in a language which was a wee bit like our own. All of this contributes to the Burns phenomenon and a global appetite for Burns. A study undertaken by our colleagues at Glasgow University has found that an estimated 9.5 million people attend Burns suppers every year. Now that's an awful lot of haggis. And that Burns is worth around £157 million to the Scottish economy. Burns is indeed the celebrity poet and one of our greatest Scottish assets and exports. Now, to someone like me, who predominantly works on Walter Scott, so I'm going to be honest about my credentials here, I work on Scott rather than Burns. This kind of celebrity and attention is enviable. Scott may have a larger monument in Edinburgh's Princes Street than any there is to Burns, but however famous he was globally in the 19th century, he can't command these levels of popularity. And anyway, what would you actually do at a Walter Scott supper? If anyone has any ideas, I'd be really grateful if you could share them with me, because we'd really like people to do something on Scott's birthday, which is the 15th of August. Nevertheless, I'm actually quite glad that I don't work on Burns, but that I work on Scott, because all that popularity comes at something of a price. And I can't help but wonder if Burns, and certainly his poetry, has become somewhat hidden under all that haggis. Certainly, it's sometimes hard to get underneath some of the myths about Burns to come to his work afresh. So just for a moment, I'd like to think about some of the myths that surrounds Burns, or at least some of the mythology around Burns. So first of all, of course, is the much repeated phrase, Burns was a heaven-taught ploughman. This idea was, of course, put about by Henry Mackenzie, and it gave the impression that Burns had had no education and that his poetry was simply inspired as if by divine intervention, if only it was that easy. This, of course, simply is not true and is actually a bit of an insult to the quality of education available to ordinary people in Scotland in the 18th century. Robert Louis Stevenson gives a far more astute account of Burns's education in his essay on the poet, Some Aspects of Robert Burns, published in Familiar Studies of Men in Books. He says nothing is more characteristic of the class in general, and William Burns, as he was when he came from the northeast, Burns' father in particular, than the pains he took to get proper schooling for his boys. And when that was no longer possible, the sense and resolution which he set himself to supply the deficiency by his own influence. For many years he was their chief companion. He spoke with them seriously on all subjects as if they'd been grown men. At night, when work was over, he taught them arithmetic. He borrowed books for them on history, science, and theology, and he felt it his duty to supplement this last, the trait is laughably Scottish, by a dialogue of his own composition, where his own private shade of orthodoxy was exactly represented. He would go to his daughter as she stayed afield herding cattle to teach her the names of grasses and wild flowers, or to sit by her when it thundered. Distance to strangers, deep family tenderness, love of knowledge, a narrow, precise, and formal reading of theology. Everything we learn of him hangs well together and builds up a popular Scotch type. So Burns actually was quite well educated, as many Scots were at the time. Another myth, Burns rescues the Scots language. Asif Khan, for example, comments that there would not be as many Scots speakers in Scotland today if it was not for Burns. Leaving aside the irony I mentioned earlier concerning the disjunction between speaking Scots at school on a daily basis and the treatment my generation at least received for that, and the annual recitation of Scots verse, there were of course poets writing in Scots before Burns. The markers of medieval Scotland, Henryson and Dunbar for example, of course wrote in Scots. But even after the Union, poets like Alan Ramsay and Robert Fergusson had paved the way for Burns. Burns had arranged for the memorial to Robert Fergusson to be placed in Canongate Kirkyard, and he wrote of him, "O thou, my elder brother in misfortune, by far my elder brother in the muse." Burns then has a literary model for writing in Scots. Moreover, Burns didn't write exclusively in Scots, but was a master of code switching, as so many people in Scotland are, or perhaps even code sliding between Scots and elegant literary English, as we see in poems like Tam O'Shanter or To a Mouse. And the form of Scots he employs is nothing like the form of Scots people really actually spoke. People in the 19th century probably encountered far more familiar Scots in the dialogue of Walter Scott's or James Hogg's novels than they ever did in Burns. So what about Burns the radical? Burns as the poet of the people. Often the author of A Man's a Man for a' that is mapped onto modern left-wing politics, as if we could easily transpose the complex politics of the 18th century to current events. Burns would of course have stuck up for ordinary people. Burns would of course have voted for independence. Burns has become something of a cipher for what many people want to think of as a modern progressive Scotland. Burns clearly did stick up for ordinary people in some of his poems, but that doesn't quite make him a card-carrying socialist, and some of his political attitudes remain ambiguous to say the least. Some of the myth-making around Burns finds it convenient to forget that he was engaged to travel to Jamaica to work on a plantation and was to be joined by Highland Mary as his wife, and that this plan would have been carried through but for her death. We have to remember too that he ended his working life as an exciseman. While this may have been driven by economic necessity, Stevenson reports that he was an active officer, and though he sometimes tempered severity with mercy, we have local testimony, oddly representing the public feeling of the period, that while in everything else he was a perfect gentleman, when he met with anything seizable, he was no better than any other gauger. So why am I engaging in what might seem like a bit of Burns bashing here on this occasion? Well, it's because I'm with Robert Louis Stevenson in his assessment of Burns and his merits, which still seems very relevant today. The unity of the man's nature, for all its richness, has fallen somewhat out of sight in the pressure of new information and the apologetic ceremony of biographers. Mr. Carlyle made an inimitable bust of the poet's head of gold. May I not be forgiven if my business should have more to do with the feet which were of clay. All the annual Burns adoration, all the emphasis on Burns the man, seems perhaps to obscure what we should really be focusing on, Burns the poet. There is indeed, writes Stevenson, only one merit worth considering in a man of letters, that he should write well, and only one damning fault, that he should write ill. And Burns does write very well indeed. Stevenson concludes, at the time when the poet made his appearance and great first success, his work was remarkable in two ways. For first, in an age when poetry had become abstract and conventional, instead of continuing to deal with shepherds, thunderstorms, and personifications, he dealt with the actual circumstances of his life, however matter of fact and sordid these might be. And second, in a time when English versification was particularly stiff, lame, and feeble, and words were used with ultra-academical timidity, he wrote verses that were easy, racy, graphic, and forcible, and used language with absolute tact and courage, as it seemed most fit to give a clear impression. If you take even those English authors who we know Burns to have admired and studied, you'll see at once that he owed them nothing but a warning. I don't think we should make saints of our poets and authors, or expect them to have heads of gold. They can have feet of clay as long as they write well. And it's perhaps the fact that Robert Burns writes very well indeed that we should be celebrating most. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Sarah Sharp, I think is coming up next from the English department to give us her thoughts. Sarah.
Hello, hopefully you can all see me. Sorry, I had a bit of an exciting moment with my technology. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to say this evening, I came across a 2012 YouGov survey. And this was a survey where about 2,000 Scottish people had been asked what their favourite Burns poem was. And in 2012, the public voted overwhelmingly for Tam O'Shanter. Their second choice was A Man's a Man, and that was followed by To a Haggis. And I think that's fairly reflective of the poems that we would pick now. I did a very unscientific study then where I asked some friends and family what they would associate with Burns, and unsurprisingly, they were talking about mice, haggis, witches, red, red roses, and auld lang syne. So these universally resonant symbols are kind of cornerstones of modern Scottish identity. Burns's most popular poems are learned in primary school and dusted off for Burns Night in Hogmanay each year. I think it's interesting to consider why particular works endure. Well, and the reason that I'm interested in this is that I think that poems do particular work for us in any given time. They chime with particular things that we're experiencing or thinking about or believing. And it's also interesting to consider how those resonances change over time. The poems that we treasure now might not be the poems that people in the past treasured when they thought about Burns. For example, if you asked a Victorian Scot for their top Burns hit, you might get a rather different response. During the 19th century, a poem called The Cottage Saturday Night was widely enjoyed by the Scottish population and was a particular hit. Now, The Cottage Saturday Night hasn't really endured as a favourite Burns work. It describes a kind of a peasant character tramping home to his cottage where he enjoys a meal with his wife and children who are frugal and humble and pious. They gather around the Bible and they enjoy a religious moment together. Now, the reason that this resonates in the 19th century is fairly obvious. It kind of gives us a lovely image of domesticity and a particular set of religious values that were really current at this particular historical moment. Interestingly, this poem was also quite popular in the British colonies during the sort of golden age of settler colonialism, so the period where Scottish people are moving around the world and settling in the Americas and Australasia. And I think there's a really good reason for that. This is a poem that has been understood to articulate an idea of Scottishness that's associated with a kind of humbleness, a hardworking, couthy, pious kind of image of Scots. And if you are a new migrant in a sort of emerging society, this is an image that you would want to embody, I'd imagine. This is a way you'd like people to think of you when they're considering you for work or for land. So I think it does a particular type of work out in the world, as well as a particular type of political work in Scotland itself. So why am I telling you about this? Well, I think that we might want to think about the poems that we're currently interested in a similar way. The poems that endure now do particular ideological work. For example, A Man's a Man, which Ali has just talked about, chimes with something that we now think about democracy and equality and has particular values that are of use to us now. So for me, anyway, the most interesting thing to think about beyond Burns himself is what work Burns' poems can do now and what they're doing within any given society. I'm now going to pass over to Tim Baker, who's going to take us through his response to the poem.
Thank you, Sarah, and lovely to see you all here. So as some of you may be able to tell, I am particularly an interloper here as an American and as a specialist in 20th century literature. And I grew up hearing Burns from my grandfather, who was not a literary man at all, but was forced to memorize poems as a child in America and would recite Burns in Scott alongside Longfellow and Tennyson and other sort of great 18th and 19th century figures. And so there was no context for it. There was no idea of nation or place. It was simply what you learned at school. The language was not Scots, as far as I could tell. It was just old poetry language. So when I moved to Scotland, when I began studying Scottish literature, I was really fascinated by the way in which a lot of early 20th century authors and later situated themselves in relation to Burns. So Hugh MacDiarmid, for instance, writing in the 1920s, had a famous credo, not Burns, Dunbar. He said that as a Scottish poet, we shouldn't look to Burns as our model. We should look further back to the work of medieval and early modern poets. But MacDiarmid's point was really not to diminish Burns, but to find ways that we could cease looking at Burns as a standalone figure. He writes in the 1940s in his autobiography, "It is agreed that Burns is a great lyric poet, but is there anything beyond that mere agreement? Is Burns really read, really appreciated by the English? Of course not. He looks forward," he says, "to a time when the English reading public ceases to pay a little lip service to Burns, leaving him unread, and begins to realize that he is a truer man and better poet than almost all the English poets put together." So MacDiarmid is clearly working from a very Scott-centric position, but it is this idea, as Ali was saying, of looking at Burns as a poet in his complexity that becomes really important. And you see this in much more recent figures much further removed from MacDiarmid. Muriel Spark, for instance, says it isn't the poetry that interests her, but the life. You can admire Burns or not as a poet, but there is something really compelling about his life. Jackie Kay, writing much more recently, says much the same thing. Burns, she says, is a kind of mirror. He makes us scrutinize not just Scotland, but the whole world. Edwin Muir, the early 20th century Scottish poet, Kay quotes, described him as a protean figure whom we can all shape to our liking. So what interests me across the 20th century is the way all of these very different writers are using Burns as a reference point both for their use of Scots, for a Scots poetic tradition, and for the figure of a poet, whether for good or for ill. And you see this in a lot of contexts within the 21st century. So you see this in Seamus Heaney, who talks about how Burns's language transported to County Antrim was the language that he first grew up with and associated. You see this a lot now with ideas of environmental consciousness. Kathleen Jamie, the Macker, right, this year, was reading to a mouse again as a sign of how we can better relate to the planet. Corrine Polwart, the folk singer, uses Burns quite uncritically, I think, as a link to the ballad tradition and the land. But I think one of the things I want to suggest, sort of going back to what Ali was saying especially, was that it isn't always easy just to situate ourselves in terms of Burns as tradition. There is a way in which modern poets, modern writers also want to interrogate Burns's reputation in various different ways. So Liz Lockhead writes a very funny poem called From a Mouse, a response to Burns's To a Mouse, in which the mouse says, "For man's dominion he was truly sorry? No, 'twas all an act." And I want to finish very quickly here with a reference to a very much more recent work, a play by the Edinburgh maker Hannah Lavery, which some of you may know. It was part of the Edinburgh International Festival last year. A play called Lament for Shiku Bio, which is about racist violence in Dunfermline in the present. It's taken mainly from court transcripts and legal records. And one of the things Lavery does with this is Burns' poems seep through. There is a moment where the play stops and the performers sing A Fond Kiss. There are references to A Man's a Man. And this idea that how we think about Burns is crucial in understanding how we conceive of ourselves in relations to ideas of a poetic tradition and of a national tradition, I think remains really central. So even though some of these figures are very critical of Burns in a lot of ways, there is this inescapability, which I at least find really fascinating. So that's really all I wanted to say by way of introduction. So I'll turn it over to Chloe and over to all of you.
Well, thanks very much to Ali, Sarah, and Tim for sharing their kind of thoughts on Burns there. So, like I said earlier, if you guys do have any questions, just type them in the chat box. I'll kind of give it a minute or two. Sometimes people are a little bit shy. We have had some kind of comments. I think people sharing their kind of memories and experiences with Burns. You know, we've had someone say, like, at school in the early 1970s, I'm sure we studied Cotter's Saturday night for an English exam. We've also had, we studied the Cotter on the English course at Aberdeen in the 1970s. Happy memories of Tom Crawford. I think my first experience with Burns was actually when I was 10. We did Tam O'Shanter as a play at school. I think the kind of fun was us all getting to dress as witches and other kind of creatures of the night. So that, I think, was my kind of first experience. And then I also studied Burns at university as well. So yeah, again, I'll just maybe give it a minute or two. If you have any questions. I'll maybe begin with maybe one of my own. I guess I kind of feel like, in terms of Scottish poetry, and really, for me personally, like Scottish writers, like Burns is the one that kind of stands out so much. Sorry, Ali with Walter Scott, but that's, I guess, the one that I'm maybe most familiar with. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts as to why you feel like that, like him in particular, has kind of so stood out.
Hello, can you hear me, Chloe?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think that is hard to tell. It's hard to figure out why would it be Burns? Why not Robert Ferguson? Why not Walter Scott, as Ali has raised? And I think Burns is so important to kind of the birth of a romanticism, I suppose. He's so influential within Scottish literature and beyond Scottish literature. He does a particular thing at an important time, I suppose, that really kind of resonates with people and gives people a kind of language to engage with a whole range of topics and a whole type of language. And that's certainly my perception of part of why he might be the poet that we remember. But I feel like Tom, like Tim and Ali will have more brilliant things to say about this, because
I don't think I've got anything more brilliant, Sarah, but I think what you were saying about the way in which different poems can be sort of almost transported for different circumstances, whether that's through time or when people emigrated and went elsewhere, they could take Burns with them and adapt them to circumstances. And I think that's partly responsible for his longevity, is that there's something about the way in which his poetry operates that allows you to sort of reimagine it and relate it to your own times. And I do think too that poetry, by its very nature, is easier to remember, so people remember bits of poetry, and it's also easier. I'm going to be a bit, I don't mean cynical, but you can stick bits of Burns on a calendar or on a china jug, and the vast amounts of memorabilia and Mauchline ware and all the things that were generated around Burns in the 19th and early 20th century that you can kind of put a few lines of poetry. So people are encountering Burns. They're sort of saturated in a way that they're not maybe saturated in other writers. And I think that's really interesting, because it's far harder. You can't really extract a bit of Waverley and stick it on a jug, but you can put a few lines of poetry and put it on. I think that's part of it. But I do think, on a more serious note, it is that way in which Burns is kind of, very much that you can transport into other times and places.
Yeah, I don't have anything more brilliant to add, but my first instinctive response is, well, because there are a lot of short poems, and a lot of poems which are quite universal in terms of their sentimentality or their sort of everyday experience. And I think for me, when I read Robert Ferguson, I feel I need to know a lot about Scottish culture, history, place. When I read a lot of the Burns lyrics that have survived, that have remained famous, that have been transported, I say, okay, I have also had an unhappy love. I have also walked in a field. And in a way, I think that does a great disservice to Burns. That the sort of poems that I grew up knowing best were the ones which I think were most universal, and that led me really to underestimate the complexity of his work overall. But I think at the same time that fact that there are these moments of recognition that we still get with Burns that we don't get necessarily with all of his contemporaries. To me, I think that's part of why his work survives more than others.
yeah, no, I was just today actually teaching Burns right before this, and we were talking about how funny Holy Willie's Prayer is. We were doing Holy Willie's Prayer, but that it wasn't a poem that my students had read before, and it's because you need to understand Scottish Calvinism, right, to get the joke, or you can kind of get the joke, but the joke is better if you understand predestination, and that's harder to do. So it's kind of one of these poems that is a fantastic read, but that maybe hasn't ended up being one that people will recite of an evening. And I think that is interesting.
Yeah. I think it's also true that people kind of absorb Burns through all sorts of ways, because, I was quoting from Stevenson's essays. So Stevenson's clearly saturated in Burns, and, Scott quotes from Burns all the time. So there are numerous references to Burns in Scott's work. So people are just, whenever they're reading in the 19th century, they're absorbing bits of Burns along the way as well.
And one other thing I was thinking is that the fact that Burns's poems remain sung is, I think, really important. That the
Yeah.
musical settings of Burns, I probably heard long before I ever read a Burns poem on the printed page. But you know, even if you look at what's going on in the Celtic Connections Festival in Glasgow right now, there are still people singing Burns songs, and I think that way of sharing the material through song probably has a lot to do with why he's remembered.
Thank you. That was a really great response, and also gave me some, I guess, things to consider, because I haven't actually thought, I guess, about, yes, like the impact that kind of songs can have, and also, yeah, like you said, the postcard quotes that you can kind of get from Burns. We've got a question which says, who is the modern day Scottish poet that we will remember in the future?
Oh, that is such a hard question to know what the future is going to sift out. You know, if we look to what was being published in the late 18th, early 19th century and what has survived and what we're still reading, I'm not sure that people at the time could have necessarily predicted that. You always say the great poet of the Romantic period is Southey. Who? You know, nobody reads Southey now. Well, some people read Southey, but you know, that's not necessarily what we would think of. So I don't know. I know who I would like it to be, but that's not quite the same thing, I think.
Oh, go on, tell us.
I'd like it to be Kathleen Jamie that people are reading in the future.
I wasn't sure if everyone else was going to jump in, if Sarah and Tim
I was
want
about
jump
to,
in
and then
with you
I
on
saw
that.
Sarah about to jump in. I mean, I would say I think Jamie has as good a shot as any we can predict. I think Jackie Kay, you know, the popularity of Jackie Kay in Scottish schools, where her poems are taught more than most, will probably guarantee Kay's longevity over at least the next 50 or 60 years. As Ali says, it is impossible to predict. And some of the poets 30 years ago, I think people would have predicted as the voices, are probably less well known now than we would have anticipated.
Yeah, no, totally. It's so hard to know. I feel like even looking at the 20th century, though, there are key people like Tom Leonard that I see kind of hanging on in there because they're doing interesting things with language that other people are still playing with, you know, and I think very often being the first of your kind can be quite key to being somebody, or not the first, but doing something that's zeitgeisty and that's of its moment. Yes. I personally, I'm such an Edwin Morgan fan. My big during
It was
modern.
allowed the it was allowed the 20th century. I think I'd say W.S. Graham, who, you know, completely went out of fashion and then had a bit of a revival because I think the centenary or something like that. So, you know, those kind of anniversaries are always important points to revitalise people.
And I guess it's maybe more of a comment maybe than a question, but we need to view Burns in the round, and why ignore the prose and letters?
Well, I think the answer to that is, you know, it's quite hard to get hold of them at the moment, but our colleagues at Glasgow are doing sterling work with the Burns edition and are in the process of editing letters just now. So you might have seen in the press, you know, coming out of that project just a few weeks ago, there were comments about amongst those letters they'd seen your correspondence where Burns had been discouraged from writing in Scots because it wouldn't do his career any good. So those things are coming back into print, and I think that's the first step to getting people to pay attention to it, really.
Yeah, letters are always a harder sell, aren't they? It's harder to convince somebody to read a volume of letters, but I think there is so much good stuff in there, isn't there, once you get into them and once you understand the genre, that yes, it will be very exciting that people will be able to read them. easily.
Particularly when Burns, writes in the form of verse epistles as well. So, there's such an intimate sort of connection between his concept of writing a letter and writing a poem in some instances.
Thank you. The next one is Burns mania possibly due to Victorians romanticising Scotland, a la shortbread, cake tins, etc.
I suppose in some ways, yes. I think it is part of a parcel of Scottish things that people love, isn't it? But in other ways, I think it's got to do with the influence he had on a whole variety of things. During the 19th century, a colleague of ours I think it's just Clyde, Kirsty Blair, has just finished a project on working class poetry from the 19th century. And what she discovered is that one of the poets that people were most likely to copy when they wrote poetry for newspapers was Robert Burns, because he appeared to be this really great example of how you write working class poetry that reflects your experiences. So his resonances were for all kinds of different communities. And I've mentioned his role in colonial settings, which is what I'm interested in. And part of why Burns endures is because he has a particular function within associational culture. So the culture of kind of Burns clubs and things in colonies where Scottish people settle, and he becomes a kind of figure that you can gather your feelings around of identity and of trying to stake out who you are in a new place. But he also influences, for example, the New Zealand labour movement. Many of the founding figures of the New Zealand labour movement will quote Burns all the time, which is super interesting too. So one of the things I'm interested in is the way that different communities can pick up Burns and use him in different ways. And he can be used in this kind of tourism and shortbread way, but he's also used by so many other communities for so many other different things.
Thank you. I'm cautious of I don't want to jump in too soon in case Tim or Ali want to add anything. So please just let me know if you guys do want to kind of add before I move on to things. But I think the next question actually ties really nicely into that. It says Canada has about a third of the number of statue memorials to Burns as Scotland, but 3 times more than England. And is this some sort of statement? But I guess perhaps that really kind of ties in with that sense of communities overseas gathering around, I guess, figures that kind of connect them to their homeland. But I will maybe let you maybe add a little bit more to that. Obviously, you kind of covered it quite well previously, but I'll just hand over.
No, totally. I think exactly that. I think that Burns has this importance for the diaspora in all kinds of ways. And one of the things I'm really interested in my work is picking that apart. Why is Burns a good person for Scottish migrants to gather around? Why is he particularly comfortable to gather yourself around? And yes, the role of the Burns supper is important here, this feeling that Burns is associated with conviviality potentially in a way that other writers aren't. He's about getting together and having a whiskey with your mates, maybe. And maybe that's important, that he's an author of gathering.
I think it's that, and it's also broader than that, in that you do look at Scott. There are statues to Scott all around the places where Scots went as well, and street names and place names. We do a free course on Scott, and people pin something from their own area onto a map, and just to see that kind of widespread. You could do the same with Burns, and it would be really fascinating. That when people emigrated, they did take their Scottish writers with them. One of my favourite things is that I think it's the main pocket songster, which we have in our special collections here, which has got songs by Burns and Scott in it, and it's clearly designed to have in your pocket and have your little bit of Scotland with you wherever you go when you emigrate. And I do think, when people did emigrate, it was hugely important to them that they could take their literature with them and things that connected them to home and belong, a sense of belonging when they went. So I think that's a huge part of Burns's sort of, you know, enduring popularity, is in the sense that Sarah knows far more than me. But
we've had some agreement as well, saying that some love for Kathleen, Jamie, and Jackie Kay as well. So I'm just reading that in the comments as well. And then we've also had, I find Burns's relationship with Mrs. Dunlop fascinating. Do you?
I find Burns's relationship with women, you know, is, I didn't speak about that, but you could speak about that in the sort of myth making of Burns, you know, the sort of great laureate of love in one sense, as you know, from his songs and some of his poems, and then very complex relationships with women and different social classes of women. And I think that that's really interesting. But I suppose that what I was also, you know, what I would also think is we have the poetry on the page and songs, and in some ways that's more interesting to me than what Burns did in his private life.
And we've just had a comment saying, like, I always remember our English teacher at Aberdeen Academy in the early 60s commenting when the parents greet their daughter's young man with some joy because he's not a rake. They might have been thinking, thank God it's no Rabbie Burns, which also ties in with me quite nice what we're just saying. And then we've also had, like, obviously someone commenting saying with the first Burns supper, circa 1801, his popularity is very much pre the Victorian era. And we've another question relating to the monuments. Am I correct in observing that Scottish Burns monuments are not as impressive and important as others, you know, say Scott and Edinburgh or Wallace and Stirling, despite his widespread popularity?
Yeah, nobody's got a monument as big as Scott. We used to be able to say it was the biggest monument to any writer somewhere in the world, and then somebody's gone and built a bigger one quite recently just to outdo Scott studies. I mean, the Scott monument is impressive in one sense. Thunderbird 3, as we call it in the trade, is kind of, I don't know. I think Scott would have hated it, but it's a statement of some sort. And the Scott Monument was built by subscription. And actually, Burns features on it. I don't know if everybody knows that, but you know, there's kind of Scottish poets embedded in the fancy Gothic structure of the Scott Monument, and so Burns is in there somewhere as, you know, one of the people who Scott is drawing on. But I don't know what it really says about Scott or Burns that, you know, we have enormous monument but the Wallace Monument's also interesting, you know, sometimes called the National Monument, the kind of sense that it's a gathering together of Scottish sentiment is gathered into the Wallace Monument, I think.
Totally, and I think maybe some of the monumental architecture for Burns that we overlook is that in buying the Burns Cottage and in looking after the Burns Cottage, that is in itself a piece of public monument.
Yeah.
And because it's a building, we maybe overlook that, but that in itself is a kind of statement of intent. And one of the things I'm super interested in is that there is an almost precise replica of the Burns Cottage in Atlanta that was built to mirror it because it was seen as such an appropriate monument to the poet. And I think that maybe illustrates the way that that idea of a sort of cottage has been so important to thinking about Burns.
Yeah. And now, of course, Ellisland's also been bought. Well, it's been in a trust for a while, but it's been transferred to a new trust, and you know, there's is raising money to restore Ellisland as well. So those buildings are also. You're right, Sarah.
We've had a few questions kind of come in relation to Burns's popularity in Russia. I will let you guys answer that, but I'll just read out some of the comments as well. And we've also had a question saying, is it true that Burns is popular in Russia? And they may have, maybe not now, Burns suppers. And we've also had the Soviet Union was actually the first country to issue a stamp in Burns's memory in 1956. And just a comment saying that the Russians are excellent at Scottish country dancing, for instance, and I believe hold an annual festival of Scottish country dancing. So that's just another interesting point to include in the conversation.
Yeah, I think he's still popular in Russia, and I think that continues. So I don't think that's diminished at all. It's interesting to see that Burns enthusiasts from Elgin were invited to Russia. That's great.
Yeah, I think it's maybe again that idea I was talking about of poets being able to do particular work in particular contexts, and we might think about Soviet Russia and maybe the more democratic idea of Burns or the more radical idea of Burns. That's going to chime really nicely. So this idea of a peasant poet really, really ties in to the kind of ethos that you're maybe trying to think about. So he's such an interesting chameleon because he works in different ways, in different historical moments, in different contexts. And that's such a good example. I don't actually know a huge amount about Russian responses to Scottish literature and Scottish culture, and that's so interesting that would be an icon that would kind of transfer.
Yeah, I think it probably predates Soviet Russia because certainly Scott was hugely popular in Russia in the 19th century, and I think Burns was as well. So I think it in some ways it kind of predates that, and translated too, which is fascinating. So I think, yeah, I don't know the routes by which that happens. I know there was one Russian count came to Scotland and took back a bit of Scott manuscript with him to Russia. So clearly that idea that Scottish literature was something to be interested in. He goes to Abbotsford and Scott says, "Oh, have a leaf of this that I'm in the middle of writing," kind of thing. Off he goes with it. So there was clearly an interest in Scottish literature.
Like, is this the start of maybe like a new research project, potential future trip to Russia to explore the Burns connection further? We will see. Maybe this time next year we could be bringing you another Burns celebration with a specific focus on that. We have also had the kind of question of, why is Burns, obviously the Burns supper, connected to haggis, and I guess, did Burns like haggis, or what are the kind of origins of that?
I don't know if Burns liked haggis. I've no idea. I mean, obviously it's the poem to haggis, and that's. I think it's really useful if you're going to have a kind of celebration that you've got a food stuff to kind of to have. Yeah, as I say, like, what would you eat at a Scots supper? All the food in Scott sounds vaguely disgusting unless you like, singed sheep's head and stuff like that. And I don't think we're going to be able to revive that. I don't think we'll be able to go into Markey's and buy them around about the 15th of August, So I think it's really useful that there is something you can eat that's associated with Burns, so that when the Burns supper kind of movement gets going, there's the poem and there's something you can eat. And I suppose something that is also very distinctively Scottish, although I dare say other cultures have things that are pretty much like haggis, and there's Welsh things that seem a bit like haggis to me, just maybe not always boiled up in a sheep's stomach. But so I think it's very useful to have had that, to have that food stuff. So I think it's probably the point, but whether Burns ate it, that's a whole other question.
Yes, and lucky it's so celebratory. I mean, if it was like to a shortbread, it'd be a bit less spectacular.
Yeah. Yes, to an oat cake. That wouldn't have caught on in the same way, I don't think.
Yeah, I would agree there. I will give it like a minute just in case anyone else has any questions. There's also still like a few minutes if you do. I was just going to ask, I kind of feel like, obviously, like someone said when I initially started speaking, that I don't really feel like the enthusiasm for Burns has ever kind of, died away. It's obviously been a very present part of my childhood, and I think like you said, many others that have grown up in Scotland. But do you kind of think with the emphasis just now on maintaining and reviving, like, you know, obviously Doric and Scots, do you think there's going to be even more of an emphasis on like Burns poetry and potentially more resource into, you know, preserving, I guess, the documents and researching the documents that exist? Do you think there's going to be even kind of more of a focus on that, or do you think he's done pretty well and it's just going to kind of continue as is?
I think our colleagues at Glasgow, who we work with very closely in Scottish Literature at Glasgow in the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, you know, are doing an awful lot of work on preserving documents, on looking at things that are forgeries, to getting electronic programs to work out what you know, it may or may not be Burns. So there's an awful lot of work going on around about Burns, and, you know, very good work. But in a more, you know, maybe in a more immediate way that would affect more of us, it is interesting to think that if there is a sort of a Scots revival, that people will maybe think about Burns again in different ways, and that would be really interesting.
No, absolutely. And I suppose one of the things I always hope with Burns is that he's a bit of a gateway to other wonderful Scottish writing that we're maybe less aware of right now, that hopefully this wave of interest in Scots, in Doric, in Scottish literature more generally will lead to people wanting to read texts that have maybe fallen out of publication and authors that we maybe don't think about as much. And I hope that will be the case, because there are so many wonderful texts that maybe have kind of fallen by the wayside because the language seems too hard, or they seem, you know, old-fashioned perhaps to particular viewpoints, but they're actually really wonderful texts that would be lovely to see more people reading. And more generally, what is, you know, the future life of contemporary Scottish literature? Could more people be reading Scottish authors? We hope so. That would be a lovely thing to think that this particular cultural moment could inspire, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's very much my thought, is that, you know, one of the things about Burns with that chameleon quality is there are Burns works which are important to any given cultural moment, and which can be a gateway to other forms of expression, other poets. So you know, I think, you know, I think all of us would always want to see a deeper engagement, a more complex engagement, but I think it's, you know, Burns is always going to be there as far as I can predict the future, which is not that far, but as a kind of conduit for how we explore both the thematic material, the linguistic material, and I think for me, you know, as someone who doesn't honestly sit around and read Burns of a night, but that way in which that, you know, Burns can be an opening to me, I think remains really interesting.
Yeah, I was, you know, I think teaching Scottish literature for a long time and being a Scots speaker myself, which I would class myself as being, I'm in some ways a bit sad, I suppose, that in spite of all the efforts there have been in schools and, you know, really good work being done, particularly in some areas of the Northeast at the moment, that there's still, you know, we get students who say it's too hard to read Scots, you know, it's too difficult, it's too much effort. Which is a shame. But I was just actually listening to something on the radio just before I came up the stairs for this, and it was about the idea of multiculturalism and multilinguistic contexts, and the fact that if you alert people to the benefits of multilinguistic contexts, then, you know, that's wonderful in all sorts of ways. And the Scottish Government Mother Tongue +2 policy, the sort of diversity of linguistic experience in Scotland at the moment, in a funny kind of way, might actually make encountering Scots in literature easier, or you would hope better, because when you encourage people to think that language isn't monolithic, that it can be diverse, that it can have a sort of those kind of multiple ways that we can still all communicate, then people are more open to that experience. And I really hope that that might actually have an ongoing effect on people's willingness to make the effort to read things in Scots. We've spoken about Henderson and Dunbar and the medieval Scots poets as well, and I really hope people actually think, well, it's worth the effort because it's fantastic poetry, and it's so worth the effort to read that poetry. And it's not any harder than reading Chaucer, really, because that's equally strange, but for some reason it's Scots, so it's it's a bit more, we can keep it at arm's length. So I hope that I always think one of the values of teaching Scottish literature and studying and reading Scottish literature isn't just because it's Scottish, but because it reminds us that literature comes from all sorts of places and is diverse, and reminds us about the value of multiculturalism. And I hope it can do that linguistically as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I also think, I don't know if I can kind of chime in with my own comments, but I also think, I feel like with kind of Scots and Doric, it's, for me, it's kind of, it's never been viewed as sort of like, I think there's also perception now that actually it is a kind of a language with its own kind of heritage and its own right, rather than sort of, oh, I kind of maybe should just be able to understand that because I'm Scottish. And like you said, it's actually worth the effort of taking the time to kind of understand the background to the words and knowing what the words mean, rather than kind of being like, oh, it's maybe a bit of a shame, and I should be ashamed of myself that I, as a Scottish person, I'm just not naturally, understanding everything. And I kind of hope that the like you said, with the government changing the linguistic policy at the moment, and I hope that with, I don't know, I feel like the amount of enthusiasm and awareness that's kind of growing and growing, that these native languages will remain very, very present, and hopefully more and more people will kind of get involved in reading and enjoying them. And I think just in the kind of last few minutes, we've had a kind of flurry of comments as well. Back to the haggis, I am kind of conscious of time, but hopefully I'll just kind of maybe run through these quite quickly. In the lifetime of Burns, haggis was only considered as one of the national dishes of Scotland, with the singed sheep's head, the highest culinary archetype, and tripe and black pudding, also deemed characteristic, delightful, and it was certainly not a staple food. In fact, it was seen as a rather odd and slightly, is it risible? Apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Dish, both by writers at home and by those abroad. And there's obviously a link in case anyone would like to read about that further. Another thought, the gift to the English-speaking word of traditional singing of Auld Lang Syne to close ceremonies rather than the haggis. And we've got our Henderson and Dunbar still part of the core advanced syllabus in Aberdeen. I will.
Yeah, we're still teaching Henderson, at least on our compulsory second year module. I'm not teaching Dunbar this year, but I do most years, I think.
We don't really have so many core courses anymore as we used to in the past, but Henderson and Dunbar feature in different places. Yes.
And maybe a kind of nice one to close with. This American, who's obviously, was David, that joined us, has always loved reading Burns and Scots, and it's much easier after we live in Aberdeen for 3 years. Cheers from Indiana. I enjoyed this. Well, thank you also for joining us. And I think that was probably a really nice note to kind of wrap up on. Thanks so much to Ali, Tim, and Sarah for joining us this evening and kind of sharing your thoughts and be involved in this discussion. And thanks so much to everyone who's also joined us. I was reading the kind of comments in the chat earlier that we've obviously had people joining us from both Scotland, England, Canada, the United States, Dubai, and Luxembourg. So it's always delightful to be joined by so many people from across the world who've got a connection to the university. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.